So Vladimir Putin is a no-show at the negotiations in Istanbul with Vladimir Zelenskyy. Should we be surprised, or was this to be expected? Привit, my name is Connor Klein and welcome to Geopolitics with Connor Klein. Here I give you a more nuanced and insightful view into happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. I've spent many years in the country of Ukraine itself, speak both Russian and Ukrainian, and have a background in international relations. So Vladimir Putin, surprisingly, in an effort, it seems, to stall new sanctions package from the European allies of Ukraine, who were demanding that Russia agree to a ceasefire. Vladimir Zelenskyy has basically offered a 30-day unconditional ceasefire under pressure primarily from the new US administration, the Trump administration. However, Russia has not actually had any sort of ceasefire as of any substance at all. I think Donald Trump is in power for at least 3 months at this point. We're maybe in 4 months gone into. And surprisingly, at about, I think it was like 2 a.m. in the morning earlier this week, Vladimir Putin went and gave a press conference in which he said he wasn't going to agree to ceasefire. He was just going to cut that step completely, cut it out, and go for direct negotiations with Zelenskyy himself. Zelenskyy agreed, and Putin never showed up. He sent a very low-level diplomatic delegation to Istanbul, where they were supposed to meet. Not even the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, was going to be present. So Vladimir Zelenskyy, who was in Turkey to meet the Turkish leader Erdogan, did not go to meet that delegation. They did send some diplomats yesterday. So perhaps some lower level officials from both Russia and Ukraine have met to discuss. I'm not really sure what they have met to discuss, but perhaps they've discussed something of substance. We'll find out maybe in due course. So what does this all mean? It means basically what we're watching is pretty much a theatrical performance by both Putin and Zelenskyy to seem very agreeable to finding a solution in order to placate the whims of Donald Trump, because he made a campaign promise that he would solve the war in a day. Then it became 100 days, and now hopefully it will be some time before he leaves office. The reality is on the ground that there is an impasse. Neither side has won militarily, and Russia has not succeeded in very many of its original war aims. They have managed to create a land bridge from Russia to Crimea, which they previously occupied, as well as parts of the Donbass illegally since 2014. However, they have not managed to seize really any major new population centers, with the exception of Mariupol, which they sacked back in early 2022. So for the last few years, there's been this impasse. Unless there is some sort of movement on the battlefield in favor of one side or the other, it is unlikely that there will be a change in the dynamics, unless, of course, there is some massive political upheaval in Russia, or maybe even in Ukraine, like a coup d'etat or something like that. Both sides have their original aims. Ukraine wants to be independent of Moscow, and Russia and Vladimir Putin does not want Ukraine to be independent of Moscow. And basically, unless one side or the other faces a catastrophic situation, militarily, politically, and maybe even demographically, that is not going to change. There will be, as we see, very little chance of ceasefire. Back at the beginning of the year, I put the chances of a ceasefire in 2025 at about 40%, so less than 50-50, and it would happen towards the end of the year. Now we're into May. It doesn't seem like Russia will face any major issues in terms of material and money, probably for the next few months. However, towards the end of the year, they are going to start to struggle, especially with the materiel. They're claiming they've got the manpower problem under control. They still manage to get enough new recruits into the Russian army, primarily by offering them huge salaries. But the money issue, especially if there are more sanctions, although that's unclear at this point whether the US will actually go ahead and introduce secondary sanctions that would severely hurt the Russian economy. in terms of material and the material they need for the war, they are going to start to run out of key components, key pieces by the end of this year. And maybe at that point, if there is very little progress on the battlefield, Russia goes at a snail's pace at the moment in terms of taking small pieces of territory, although none of it is particularly significant, then they may be open to some sort of ceasefire, simply because it would be in their interests to be able to restock or maybe reconstitute, maybe get the sanctions taken off to allow them to rebuild their military, presumably for another bite at the cherry at some point in the short to medium term. So going forward, we're going to see more diplomatic shenanigans and theater. However, I would not expect at this juncture to see even any sort of meaningful ceasefire, which would be normally the first step, is to get a truce of some sort and then get the parties talking. The fact that Putin wouldn't agree to that, but then said he was going to meet Zelenskyy to negotiate in person, presumably just to offer one more time a surrender deal to Ukraine, doesn't look very serious in terms of any substance. However, he is trying to play to the US administration and show that he is in theory open to some sort of peace negotiations that will provide a win for the Trump administration, which is struggling by and large after the debacle of introducing the tariffs that they've now climbed down from, mainly in the last month or so. So expect to see more of that kind of theater, but very little of substance. In the meantime, the war in Ukraine will grind on, and it is a grinder, and we will see presumably very little changes in the territory. However, the continuation of massive losses in material and lives, primarily on the Russian side, while they continue to try and break Ukrainian resistance. So drop me your comments down below what you think of the last week of diplomatic maneuverings, and Slava Ukraini, as always. Do побачення.